Hi, my name is Ben Atkinson and welcome to the Functional Health Podcast. I interview some of the leading voices in nutrition and lifestyle medicine, and I will share with you their stories, their expertise and their advice, shedding light on the industry from each of their perspectives to help improve your health from today. This week, I'm delighted to share with you my conversation with Marek Doyle. Marek is an experienced nutritionist and is extremely well versed in helping those with metabolic and immune disorders. Today, we take a bit of a deeper dive into thyroid conditions, covering everything from the who, the what, the where, the why, the how. So, without further ado, Marek, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben.
Hi, you're very welcome. So we've just been chatting before, but for people that don't know you, can you just give a rough introduction how you got into this space?
Of course, yeah. So I am a nutritional therapist, and I've been doing it for about 15 years. So it's been an interesting 15 years. And whereas I started off working primarily with athletes, and I'm looking at body composition, conditioning, then started to work much more with members of the public who wanted fat loss, and that was going very well, apart from those for which it wasn't going so well. And that always left this question as to, well, why are some people responding so well and others not? And that's obviously been the question that's pretty much driven my thinking, my research, the statistical analysis over this time. And equally, I've had two hits on my own health, once in 2007, which was pretty much a case of great diet but terrible living, overly training, undersleeping, doing all the things that I recommend others avoid. 2012, moldy flats, 2 hits on my spine in the same week.
Oof.
So that was another another interesting phase. But both of those did sculpt my thoughts. The first one made me realize how modern medicine is just not able to tend to those that don't quite have a named condition. And the second time, it really made it clear that actually, there was a whole lot more that I needed to integrate, a whole lot more factors than my plans and model at the time had actually catered for. So harsh learning and forced learning, but learning nonetheless. So since then I've built a model of personalised nutrition. So very much a case of, well, what does the individual in front of me need to do in order to achieve their goals? So I hope that's a reasonable summary of 15 years.
It certainly is, and it's very hard to do. And I think, there is a saying like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think that certainly applies to you in your clinical practice, right?
Well, I think what doesn't kill you generally makes you tired, weak, and anxious. But hopefully that then leads on to, a more advanced, more comprehensive perspective, which I like to think is the perspective I now sit with.
Good. Well, I'm glad, because this is the reason why I'm speaking with you today. So, and we're going to talk about...
Well, let's see where we go, shall we?
So today is all about thyroidism. Some of my family have been affected by Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and obviously there's a whole spectrum of illnesses and conditions which can affect the thyroid. And for those people who are listening which may not be aware, the thyroid is a gland. It's a small butterfly-shaped gland at the base of the neck, and it's responsible in producing hormones essential basically for the whole body metabolism, right? A lot of people call it the master gland. So where did your interest in this kind of area begin?
It's difficult to say where it began, but it's just one area that I think is so fascinating because, one, this is the front line of all treatment plans. There's no organ system in the body that doesn't have some sort of impact on the thyroid. and there's no organ system that isn't impacted by the thyroid. So it's got to be central in every treatment plan that we're looking at. You know, whether I'm looking at interventions in the gut or interventions at the adrenals or mitochondria, well, all of those are having major interactions with the thyroid, and they're two-way interactions. But also, number two is that this is also just the area, probably more than any other, where dogma in both conventional medicine and in alternative medicine, this is where we're getting it most wrong. And this is where there's more elementary errors, I think, than anywhere else. So, yes, it's a fascinating subject.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's really interesting about this whole area is that there's so many physical symptoms, I feel, which a lot of people experience, and it'd be quite hard to distinguish between when you're experiencing low thyroid or if you're just fatigued. And there's multiple different reasons, obviously, why fatigue can occur. And I was wondering, what are the physical and clinical symptoms of if someone has a thyroid condition, and what, I guess, you see most frequently in clinic?
Well, the biggest set of symptoms will always revolve around energy. So in those instances, I'm mainly looking for issues with brain activity, brain function, sharpness, also investment in the digestive tract, also ability to finish jobs, whether that's, you know, completing the rejuvenation of skin turnover, whether that's permitting the activity in the follicles that allow for us to have normal, thick, luscious hair. Those, I think, are always very key, because, yes, of course, there's that overall fatigue, but not necessarily in those who are pumping out excess levels of adrenaline. I mean, they won't sleep, but they won't necessarily identify with the fatigue. And of course, we always have this presentation of low thyroid equals weight gain. And that is often the case, but there's a lot of people that I work with who are underweight with low thyroid. So it is worthwhile touching on that it's not a case of, well, you can't have low thyroid because if you did, you'd be overweight, as many of my clients have been told by their doctors. So in that instance, we're really interested in the thyroid in regards to the way that provides energy regulation for every single cell in the body. So in that sense, if something's not working, anything, one question that we should ask is the thyroid involved? Is it behind this? Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not.
Just to revert back to what you said before about people being underweight with hypothyroidism, that is hugely interesting for me, because I automatically assume if your metabolism is low, quite often people present as being overweight, but I'm not sure, does being hypothyroid affect your appetite, for example? So people will naturally reduce their calories, maybe when they reduce their thyroid hormone output?
So, yes, I've seen a lot of that pattern whereby we're seeing the meat substantially less. And equally, what's interesting is your digestive process, that takes up 30% of our energy requirements every single day. So there's actually a huge investment that we need to put in order to get back. And it's really interesting when you look at the number of ways through which the thyroid can help us, quote unquote, help us by reducing the formation of T3, the active thyroid hormone. And when that happens, there's so many processes in various different cells that just aren't going to occur the way they should. So digestion is a perfect example of one of those zones. And so what happens when we stop producing the bile? What happens when we stop moving the digestive tract the speed that we should, and thus permit these very pro-fermentation conditions? Suddenly we're creating a environment where microbial imbalance is nearly guaranteed. What happens then, and the inflammatory impact that now has, which further drains our energy resources and alters mitochondrial function, impacts on the way that fat cells respond to their signaling. So often, we're going to see a dramatic shift across a whole number of areas. But if we've got chaos in the gut, that often can have a huge impact on appetite, because turns out if humans feel horrendous every time they eat, they tend to eat less.
Yeah. And what you just outlined there was like a classic, I guess, functional medicine outlook on on a condition, right? Because if someone
hate to be predictable,
but if someone, cause it's just interesting, like when you outline it like that, because saying that hypothyroidism affects the gut and then maybe might lead to something like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, for example, SIBO, and then people might look at the SIBO and think, well, that's the reason why they're tired, because it's the gut which is causing maybe nutrients not to be absorbed as much. They're eating less naturally because it's painful when people do eat often. And then people will concentrate on that rather than the root cause, which is hypothyroidism.
Well, exactly. And that is actually something that I don't know whether it's just me. So, interested in your input on this. But I feel like the last 2 years, all I hear people talk about is SIBO. And SIBO A, SIBO C, SIBO D. And and it's a really important thing, because what a nuisance for when you can't eat without experiencing pain.
Yeah.
When you can't eat without generating gases that will cause havoc with the cells in your gut lining, and therefore mean that there's no longer a barrier between the gut and the bloodstream, and that's kind of not what we want. So when eating is actually driving the problem, well, you can't not eat. And so it is a really big deal. But again, we see it with thyroid. Some people look at thyroid, that's the root cause of everything. Or they look at, SIBO, we found it, we found the root cause. Instead of realizing, well, actually, yes, it is the root cause of many symptoms that we've just been talking about. But what's the root cause of that?
Yeah.
And then you realize that actually we've got a cycle going on. Weird that the body would have ways that it would change its function based on the contextual cues that it's receiving. But turns out this survival machine that we all walk around in, the human body, it's capable of responding to the environment, both outside cues, inner cues. And we're always looking at cycles. Well, if we're not getting anywhere.
Yes. So just to outline it for people, when you're looking at the thyroid hormone and you're trying to maybe diagnose or see if the thyroid is involved, what hormones are you looking at and what do they do?
So if I was to run a thyroid panel, I would run TSH,
yes,
T4, free T4, T3, reverse T3, and antibodies. So that means anti-TPO, which is anti-thyroid peroxidase, and anti-TG, which is anti-thyroglobulin.
And just to for the listeners, the TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone, and then that stimulates the thyroid to create T3 or T4, which is converted into T3, but they actually make both of them at the same time. TPO is the thyroid peroxidase enzyme. It's an enzyme normally found in the thyroid gland to create T3 and T4, but you can find TPO antibodies, which is a predictor of hypothyroidism or a form of autoimmune thyroidism. Really interesting. Conventional tests don't normally test for TPO, I don't think. Is that right?
Well, yeah, so there are occasions when I will see somebody for the first time and they'll come in with a number of tests, and occasionally it's included, which is nice to see. But so many times I will be told, well, it's not my thyroid because actually that's been tested. And then we look at the test and it was just TSH and T4. And to the day, and we are still in a scenario where most doctors are running just TSH and T4, which is scandalous. So there's, I'll lean on a study here which demonstrated that almost all hypothyroidism will be missed if you only measure TSH and T4. And yeah, this study it was done in 1979. So it's hardly new. And yet here we are 41 years later, and it just isn't something that's being applied. It can pick up on some forms of hypothyroidism, but majority, 80%, I believe it was in this study, will be missed from these markers, which are pitifully inadequate for most people.
Yeah, especially complex conditions. Something we didn't touch upon, but maybe it's good because people which are aware of the hypothyroid or hyperthyroid and trying to do something about it, they'll be aware of TSH and T3 and T4, but maybe not reverse T3 or T4. Could you explain what they are and why they are important for us to look at?
Okay, yeah. So I feel like understanding the thyroid is always easiest done by understanding the enzymes. Now, the majority of thyroid issues that I see don't actually involve any dysfunction or any problems with the thyroid gland itself. So, of course, the thyroid gland is pretty central to the thyroid system, but the job of the thyroid gland is to respond to that chemical signal you mentioned, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And then it produces T4, tiniest amount of T3. But yeah, it mainly produces T4 into the bloodstream. At that stage, the thyroid gland has done its job. So now it's the role of these enzymes, which you'll find dotted around every cell in the body. And these deiodinase enzymes do exactly what they say on the tin. They remove an iodine molecule, and as such, T4 becomes T3, which is now the active thyroid hormone. And so that's where we're going to see the primary stimulation of proteins inside the cell. It will stimulate cells in the pancreas to release pancreatic enzymes. It will stimulate bone cells to produce proteins that turn over bone. It will stimulate brain cells to produce neurotransmitters. It allows these cells to do what they're meant to do. And it's the deiodinase enzymes that actually do that. So deiodinase 1, that's the primary focus for most of our discussions, because that's the one that turns the almost inactive T4 into highly active T3. Lovely. But yes, as you mentioned, reverse T3. Well, this is a slightly different version of the enzyme. This is deiodinase 3. And it's induced by a number of signals in the body. So infection is a great example. Lack of oxygen is another example. High cortisol can do that. Antioxidant issues. So there's a number of cues which will induce the release of this enzyme, deiodinase 3, and that will form reverse T3. So reverse T3 is very similar in its molecular shape to good old, lovely, wonderful T3, regular T3, except it blocks T3's action. So this is a defensive thyroid hormone. And poor old reverse T3 is continually painted as the bad guy. It's always spoken of in the sense that we must get that reverse T3 down. And I think it's really worthwhile just understanding the nuance. Reverse T3 is highly protective. It slows down the activity of these energy-using processes inside each cell, so that the body can actually help restock its energy supplies. It turns down usage to allow you a better chance of surviving. And so, yeah, that's whereby, trying to jump past these checkpoints and sidestep the body's regulatory systems, it can easily get into trouble. And instead, I would always be looking at, well, what's inducing this increased reverse T3? Yes, we want a scenario where the body feels no need to produce more reverse T3. We don't want to ignore the fact it is producing reverse T3. It is blocking thyroid activity deliberately. So my question in those scenarios is why?
Right, perfect. I think you outlined that beautifully, and especially you touched on points which I wasn't fully aware of either. So that's that's great. One thing I want to discuss with you is like the role, because this is a question I get asked a lot, right? Mrs. Patient, I eat well. I eat whole grains. I don't eat any processed foods. I have 7 portions of fruits and vegetables a day. But I've got hypothyroidism. Why? And this is a question which comes up a lot. And I think if you're looking at a person with a healthy lifestyle, it can be very difficult and upsetting for them when they get diagnosed with an illness which they think they've done everything in their power to protect them from, especially if they have their family had it or whatever. Why do you think these instances happen? And obviously, a functional medicine answer will be like it's different in everybody. So I'm fully expecting that.
You can't say.
But is there any...
No, I can say.
Okay.
The question is very relevant because I know exactly what you mean. If I'd put in all that effort, if I'd invested my financial and emotional resources in being healthy and playing to the rules, I'd feel pretty ripped off if I then, basically was sent away from the doctor's office with this diagnosis and that little small print at the bottom. By the way, this will be forever because there's no cure for hypothyroidism. Give me a break. So the question, why? Well, first, it is really worthwhile in recognizing that that's going to be different from one person to the next. So let's run through a couple of scenarios. The single most interesting one is always going to be the stress factor. So you can eat as great a diet as you want, but if as part of your healthy routine, you're waking up at 4:45 every morning and doing 10K run, and then obviously dashing to the juice bar to get yourself a lovely kale and spirulina smoothie, and then dashing over to wherever you need to be, and then getting on the train. All of that stuff that sometimes we do all get pulled into doing. The question is how much of a stress load is going on. Equally, can there be internal induction of that limbic response? Absolutely, and that's especially relevant if we have low energy status or if we have excess inflammation, which can have a massive impact on the activation profile of the brain. But in any case, the stress autoimmunity link is very well established, and the primary driver involves the gut lining. Now, we talk a lot about leaky gut, And when we talk about leaky gut, we're always talking about the role of gluten and the role of alcohol and inflammatory responses, allergies, so on and so forth. All of these things that can impact on the zonulin and the gaps between these cells and basically create holes between these cells. And that is indeed a very important thing to consider. What I never really hear people talk about is the role of stress in opening up the gut. And so whereas that inflammatory process that I was discussing, that's paracellular permeability, we're now talking about transcellular permeability. This is a different process whereby during that stress reaction, we're not just emptying our fat cells to get more resources into the bloodstream. We're not just emptying our glycogen stores in the liver to supply more available nutrients into the bloodstream. We're also opening these channels in the gut lining. The cell itself creates a channel to get in sugar and salt into the bloodstream. It's a desperate attempt to scavenge more of these resources, which we are likely to need if we're going to be running, fighting, potentially bleeding. So this, unfortunately, while it does give us the sugars and the salts that we want, also allows piggybacking to go on. Little endotoxins, little fragments of dead bacteria, actually part of the membrane of certain types of bacteria. And when these bacteria die, these little fragments are small enough to get into the bloodstream, which is where we do not want them. Now, you can't get infected from these, but your immune system is going to be stimulated into a very dramatic level of excess activity because it's reading these non-mammalian barcodes. It knows that there is bacterial components in the bloodstream, and it does what evolution has designed it to do. Pulls the emergency cord and elicits a violent response to try and stop you from dying from sepsis. And there's just one problem with that. Where is that inflammation going to lead? What problems is it going to cause? Not only with brain fog and low energy and this agitation and energy signaling, but will that now induce autoimmunity somewhere? We know the thyroid is one of the most vulnerable glands. It's the only gland in the body that actually uses hydrogen peroxide, which when it's in a bottle is called bleach. It actually uses that just for normal physiology. It is sensible. We know that interferon treatments, which is a immune treatment, will induce thyroiditis in 40% of people receiving that. That's how sensitive the thyroid gland is. So that's one way that we could see a great diet and autoimmunity occur together, even though, according to the rules, we shouldn't. We could also go into environmental exposure, mold.
Absolutely.
That's a great way to cause inflammation. And, what if you have those small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and the foods you're eating happen to be flaring that? I mean, there's more options, but I'll end up talking all day. So
no, the mold point I've never actually touched upon before, but the process that you're outlining, the inflammatory response with the leaky gut leading to autoimmunity, that molecular mimicry, I actually touched upon it in episode 1 with Dr. Tom O'Brien. He spoke about this as well, and it's something which comes up in basically every autoimmune condition, right? And he has this beautiful saying that the chain will break at the weakest link. So so a lot of people will come with different autoimmune conditions, but the underlying root cause may be relatively similar in terms of it all starts with that gut hyperpermeability, that leaky gut, which is which what you've just described. When you talk about...
and the both types I think are really important, and it's just a shame that as a community, we're only discussing the inflammatory induced, permeability which separates cells. We're not considering that actually the central nervous system will deliberately induce permeability given a circumstance where it believes this action is in its interests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's so interesting because like stress never really comes into it. And I remember Rangan Chatterjee, he wrote that Stress Solution book, and he said in his first book that he thought nutrition played the biggest role in health, and then in his second he said stress. Now I'm not sure if that was just to sell his book, but I read both of them and they are very compelling and easy to follow. But the point of stress, I think it's more than ever so prevalent, especially in modern day. And I love being active and doing working and also doing bits on the side, and just because I'm passionate about this topic, right? So I love communicating the science to people, but I do tend to burn myself out on occasion, and I know I shouldn't, but it does happen. And I think it's something which, even though we know certain aspects of our lifestyle are bad that induces stress, we still kind of want to do it, which is something.
Well,
which
it's
I
a
find
fascinating subject, and I mean, I always need to take a big deep breath before I broach the subject in clinic, because honestly, most people don't want to be told that they may need to deal with the stress issue, because it's very difficult to define. Mm-hmm. I look at it from a neurobiological basis. I think some of the approaches that combine both neurobiology and frontline psychology can be really handy in these instances, using what we've yielded from the brain scan technology that's now become much more prevalent, and being able to actually correlate the role of core emotive circuitry versus inhibitory circuitry, and being able to pin that down to key areas of the brain. So, for example, we have an area of our brain called the default mode network, and that's responsible for our rules, our preferences, our beliefs. It acts in a filter sense. But what's fascinating about that is how overactive that area is in individuals with depression disorders and anxiety disorders, and how when you challenge someone's belief system, that's an area that lights up big time. And there's I won't go into the various tools, tricks, and approaches that we've got to address these scenarios where it is overactive. But I think one important pattern is that for some people, they are so overwhelmingly stressed that they never actually reach a stage where they're not in full mobilization mode, or as I may well call it in clinic, battle mode. If the bullets are always flying overhead 24/7, they actually don't have any contrast, in which case they genuinely cannot fathom that they are stressed, because stress doesn't affect them. And that's where I would say is one of the most useful starting points if people want to consider, could stress be playing a role in my symptoms? Well, the short answer is yes, because you're human. But the more useful answer is, if you don't feel any difference in scenarios where other people are getting flustered and stressed out, or after which they're feeling tired and need to go and recover, what we're really seeing there is no contrast, regardless of how stressful and how much an emergency scenario is induced in your physiology. If there's no contrast, that means you're never leaving battle mode. So that would be something that I would drop as a point to consider. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, there's a whole load of things that I think are relevant when it comes to these things. That's just one of them. But it's one that's often overlooked, that's for sure.
Yeah, 100%. And you touched upon mold as well. And that is something I've never really covered before. And probably something which I think people might be hearing, oh, well, hang on, he's talking about mold and that affects my health. I've never really heard of that before. So that might be something which might be perceived as something quite contentious. What do you think?
I think contentious is a good word, primarily because I understand somebody who may well have spent a lot of their emotional resources, a lot of their time, and it's hard if you are chronically unwell and fatigued to do normal things and to get the task done that other people are actually managing with ease. That in itself is such a daily challenge. And then when you go to a nutritional therapist who's been recommended to you by someone who's basically told you the outcome, which of course is a really lovely new world and options that they had begun to give up hope on. Yeah. And then they tell you, we should do a mycotoxins test, and you see that your mycophenolic acid or any other mycotoxin is 35 times higher than the top of the reference range. Well, what does this actually mean? Well, on one hand, it's great. We now know why those 17 previous protocols didn't work. You never had a fair chance because mold is that bad for these scenarios, at least in most people. But the bad news is, well, if this is a rented property, you're probably going to need to move out, because let's not naively expect parasite landlords to think, do you know what? I will spend the £8,000 to get this properly solved and resolved, because I care about providing a healthy environment for the tenants that pay me. Normally, you're moving out. That's stressful for anyone. That's what in the top 3 life stressors list for moving home. So it's not something anybody wants to do, but often it's necessary, and I'm the lucky guy that gets to deliver that bad news. Or, of course, maybe it's their own home, in which case, well, it's easy to get solved. Just reach deep into that wallet, the one that's been drained for the last 6 years as you've gone from practitioner to practitioner and done expensive tests and speculated on this £120 wonder supplement. So, yeah, it is contentious, but equally at the same time, I have never seen anybody get the results that they should when they've been exposed to mold and they don't take action on it. So
what kind of environment?
It's a big one.
I guess when you're saying mold, like the first thing that pops in my head, and I know you don't mean this, is like mushrooms growing on like the wall. Do you know what I mean? Or are we just talking like dampness? Can you always see the mold that's there? I guess for people at home that may be thinking, well, my house isn't moldy, but might be affected by these things.
Yeah, so it's very simple if you really want to know whether there's any mold in your home, which would be to do an ERMI test or to get some sort of air sampling done. That will tell you what you need to know. But it's a lot of money to shell out. We're talking several £100s in most instances. Or, of course, pay a professional to come out, do the entire site survey, and that's normally about 750, sometimes more. So it's a big old chunk. There's a mold specialist called Michael Schrantz, and he's got a great phrase. He goes, often you just don't need a specialist. It's like a flat tire. You don't need to call out the repairman to see you've got a flat tire. It's so obvious. And in that instance, a lot of the people I work with, maybe we'll do a VCS test. Maybe we'll follow that up with a mycotoxin profile, which is urinary levels of mold toxins. And they say, do you know what? I actually have seen a huge growth of dark black mold in which case we know what needs to be done there. We don't need any special testing or expert eyes to come in and tell us, yeah, you've got mold. We know. So on a really cheap way of seeing if there's any vulnerability, get a cheap hygrometer.
Okay.
Measure the humidity levels in every room. Compare it to outside. Now, apart from after when you just use the kitchen or when you've just used the bathroom, apart from those times, your humidity levels should be the same in every room, and they should be the same as outdoors. If not, we got to be suspicious. Doesn't guarantee there's an issue, but it certainly means that we may well be looking at that. In other words, if you've got 85% humidity in your bathroom and 45% in every other room, and no one's turned on any taps and no one's had any showers for 12 hours, I'm very suspicious of what's going on in that room.
Because that is like the perfect environment for the growth of mold. There we go. Got my words out eventually.
Yeah, it's true. So it's very easy to grow mold if you have high humidity and if you have a lack of air circulation. And this is where mold is something, I'm sure 20 years from now, when we're finishing off the last loo roll that we bought earlier this year, we will also be looking back at this time and thinking, why weren't we smarter about mold? So from the 1970s onwards, governments have induced builders, they've given them incentives to build super energy efficient homes. And to do that, what have we done? Double glazing. We seal in the home to allow no air exchange on the outside. That's a pretty silly thing to do. And then on top of that, we end up living in cities, often these old buildings that have been upgraded with the double glazing, and we might dry our clothes indoors. And it is a conundrum for many. You know, where else you meant to dry them? Equally, do you need to get a dehumidifier? Yes, if that's the only place you can dry clothes, you have to get a dehumidifier. Otherwise, it's only a matter of time.
Yeah, I mean, I live in a flat and we don't have any outdoor space, unfortunately, right now. And so when I dry my clothes in the house, if I'm not putting them in the dryer, which I rarely do, they're by two open windows, and I leave them open basically all day. Until those clothes are dry, right? But I still don't think that's probably enough. But yeah, it's just some things which you just have to, do the best you can, I suppose. But that is the cheap test that you were talking about is something which I'm considering doing now.
Well, it would be interesting to see. So it's but that is just one of these obstacles that often. I'm a nutritional therapist. My focus is the nutrients, the enzymes, the physiological levels of all these chemicals. That's my specialist area, and that's my entire focus for the last 15 years. But the key thing that I've always looked at and run countless statistical analyses over the results I'm getting, and more importantly, when I've not been getting them, has been to try and establish, well, when is nutrition going to work here? And when is nutrition not going to work?
Yes.
And that is, I think most people can agree, it's a really simple but really important question to ask. And that really is what we should all be asking, I feel, instead of trying to sell the idea that, no, these supplements, these are the best way to deal with thyroid issues or whatever concern we're dealing with. Trying to sell, the approach. It's go to an acupuncturist with chronic illness. What does an acupuncturist recommend? Acupuncture. Go to a chiropractor with the same illness. What does the chiropractor recommend? Go to a nutritional therapist. And so, in that sense, I think the mold, as well as postural issues, as well as those stress issues. These are issues where I try to take in as much data as I can to quickly and accurately identify, can this person respond to the nutritional support that I'm about to provide. And if they can't, why do we think that's the case? Of where do they need to go before they can now have a fair chance? And weirdly enough, when they actually go away and take away those obstacles and then come back to me, I look great, because now they respond often to very simple stuff that is just what they needed. But if I had given that to them previously, it wouldn't have worked.
Yeah. I mean, let's talk about like what a protocol would look like in terms of nutrition, I guess, because like there are a plethora of books that you can buy right now and different diets, and we've touched upon why you can't just give one diet to someone and expect it to work. But the Autoimmune Paleo protocol, which is a diet which I think you abstain from grains, nuts. I'm gonna lose one of them here, but grains, nuts, legumes, dairy, eggs, soy, corn, and nightshades. Have I missed anything else off? I think that's it.
That sounds about right to me.
Yeah, so it's a very restrictive diet, and a lot of people use this for, but not just thyroidism, hyper or hypo, but any autoimmune condition. And I guess it's meant to be one of the most anti-inflammatory diets. I just wanted to get your opinion on it and whether you think it's always necessary.
So, is it always necessary? Definitely not. Is it necessary for a decent chunk of people? Definitely. So there's a lot of people who they have lost the ability to tolerate plant poisons. And there's enough plant poisons out there. I think for some people, it does require a bit of a paradigm shift to acknowledge that, these plants don't actually exist in order to try and enrich the human diet. They're existing primarily to perpetuate their own genetic code. And so in some ways, for example, with fruit, there's a nice evolutionary trade there. They, when ripe, they will now have a particularly low plant poison count because they want animals to eat them and then poop out the seeds as they move to the next field and the field beyond that. So that's a nice evolutionary trade. There's a relationship that we can exploit there. And there's a reason why a lot of fruit, when ripe, are a good option. But there's a whole load of foods that don't want to be eaten, and they will produce very potent poisons. Let's take two examples: oxalates, lectins. So oxalates are, they're a very good example of these natural pesticides, and they will poison mammals that eat them, unless, of course, like humans, we counter-evolved systems to handle them. And in that sense, we've got multiple digestive processes that should neutralize them. And that's why for the majority of the population, they'll never need to worry about what oxalates are, what foods contain them, because they can eat as much as they want without ever noticing. But if there is a disinvestment in the digestive tract, and suddenly we're not breaking down food so well, if there's antibiotics that wipe out some important bacteria that would otherwise have gobbled up some of these oxalates, if anything opens up the gut lining, those free oxalates that previously might have passed out in the stool, now they can be absorbed. So in these instances, the individual suddenly starts absorbing them. And these tiny crystals now end up accumulating at a variety of areas in the body. And we don't know why some people with oxalate issues develop skin problems. Other people get joint pains. Other people get bladder irritation. It is fascinating how whenever I see oxalates on testing, and they're included on the organic acids test, which is something I ask all individuals to take before our initial consultation. So we can already see whether that issue is in place. And while the consequence of those oxalates may be slightly different from one person to the next, we're always expecting to see inflammation. So that's one chemical. Lectins are another. Lectins, another classic example of plant pesticides that are naturally present in a whole load of foods. And it is a load of foods.
Yeah.
That is the grains, the nuts and seeds, the nightshades, the legumes, and conventionally reared dairy that has consumed any of those grains. So it's a perfect example of, well, we should see those cells that line our guts. They should produce the secretions that bind up and neutralize the lectins. And so we should be able to eat them without any issue. All is good. But again, if there's any lack of energy metabolism there, and maybe that's where thyroid stimulation might play a role. Maybe that is due to ongoing inflammatory issues that wreck mitochondrial function. Maybe there's another disturbance to the mitochondrial function there. There's multiple ways that can occur. But yeah, if that's not going on, then suddenly we are sensitive to those lectins and will continue to be until we do two things. One, remove the problem, and two, undertake remedial steps so that we're no longer sensitive to them. And it's very, very feasible to do that. People who have issues with them now, it's not a case that they just can't eat those foods. It means they're likely to need a period of time without eating them while we take control of what's going on in the gut and get that working the way it should.
Absolutely. And just for the listeners, lectins are carbohydrate binding proteins, and they are in a lot of foods, right? But it's important to note that not all lectins are the same, and people can tolerate different amounts as well, which makes it even more complicated when you're trying to work out what you can and can't tolerate. But yeah, the oxalates, when I got really interested in some of Chris Kress's work, he's an acupuncturist cum nutritionist in the US, and he looks at like ancestral health, and he was talking about how people do consume grains like in indigenous tribes when we were evolving tens of thousands of years ago, but quite often they're fermented, or the nuts would be soaked, which would help to reduce the phytic acid content. And when it's interesting with grains, because when you soak and ferment them and even grind them, you reduce the phytic acid content and the amount of lectins in them. So there are ways to consume foods, and even kale's something which is, touted as extremely healthy, and it is in some regard, but it does contain some components which can be very damaging, like you just mentioned, oxalates, which you can reduce by lightly steaming them. Who
knew that humans who have maintained great health for thousands of years and have handed down tools and tricks to do so might actually have some wisdom we could use?
I know.
Who knew?
It's so weird. It's like we kind of jump or run before we can walk. Do you know what I mean? We try and just like, oh yeah, this is good. This food is good in any form, rather than looking at, well, maybe it's not. Maybe what it contains could potentially damage us. It's not just what's in the food. It's not just vitamins and minerals. There's other components to it.
Yeah, exactly. And humans, I think that you touched on something so valuable there. Don't get me wrong. I have spent more than my fair share of evenings with 20 different PubMed windows open. Very interested in what the literature has to say, and I will constantly scour it for mechanisms and seeing proof of hypotheses that I think could do something good. But equally, we've got a whole world of information on how to support human health, how to protect digestive processes, and how we can best eat good foods and feel good from all of these civilizations that have come before us. And just because it wasn't in a double-blind, randomized controlled trial, well, if it's been working for 14 different civilizations for thousands of years and none of which have ever met one another, they've all independently come to the same conclusion that this process works. Well, maybe there's some sense in taking that on board and asking ourselves, how can we integrate that into what we're doing? It's not normally hard.
You're so right. And I always say this: what's called absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, right? It's been said so many times before, but it's so true. If a diet's working for someone and they see a reduction in symptoms, or they're taking a supplement and it's not harming them, and the only effect that you're seeing is a benefit, I don't need to see a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial to say that that's working for that person. I'm always, don't get me wrong, and you just highlighted it as well, I always think we should follow the evidence first and foremost, and the best evidence that we have available. But if we can't do harm, and the only kind of side effect is a possible benefit of an intervention, why not give it a go?
Well, exactly, yeah. And in that sense, if it was the case that barking at the moon every second Thursday of the month was inducing wonderful turnarounds in 90% of individuals with autoimmune conditions, and there was no side effects, well, I'd say, well, look, I don't understand how this is working, but we know there's no side effects. Why not give it a go?
Yeah, just bark at the moon every Thursday, yeah.
Luckily, I've got better strategies than that, I'd like to say. At least I like to think so.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad.
We both are.
Yeah. And that brings me on to something which, I really struggle with this. And this is something which is gaining a lot of traction right now, which is the carnivore diet. Right, a diet which, and different people do it in different ways. So I've read a lot on, I'm gonna butcher his name now. His second name is Baker.
Sean Baker.
Sean Baker, that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
And then you've got the other one, which is Saladino, and I always forget his first name.
I believe it's Paul Saladino.
Yeah, Paul Saladino. I'm doing really well here. But Sean Baker, he primarily, or certainly did when he just started, just ate steak, ribeye steaks and beef, for example. And I can't remember why he started this diet, but he said he felt great, really good health. Paul came at it from a different angle and was experiencing like eczema and kind of autoimmune conditions. And he's trained in functional medicine, and he kind of knows that he gets it. But he wasn't experiencing the kind of health that he wanted through like basically consuming plant foods, which I thought was really interesting. And he took an approach of a nose to tail carnivore diet, so eating everything from offal, and we know offal contains a variety. It's one of the most nutrient dense foods in the world, certainly liver is, as well as some of the skins and collagen and different elements, even things like testicles he goes as far to eat, which is, by most opinions, very extreme. To try and get the nutrients
I
you need.
can't actually say I've ever eaten testicles.
Well, neither have I. They might be wonderful. I don't know. But
well, exactly. What are we missing out on?
Yes. And this thing, but no, that's not the thing. What the thing is when he's consuming this, I have this, that there isn't that much evidence that a carnivore diet will be of benefit. And in my head, I know it's going to be a real struggle for people to consume all the nutrients they need to not get a nutrient deficiency related disease. And I know everyone starts on a spectrum of health. We're born with a certain genes that we can't change. We can help them with epigenetics and our lifestyle, etc. But some individuals will react and are sensitive to toxins and plant chemicals more than others, and we know this just by talking about lectins. What do you think of the carnivore diet? Have you ever seen any evidence that it works clinically?
Yes.
right.
Yes, I have.
This
so
is
it's
great.
not something that I would necessarily be recommending to people as standard, because as you say, we do have very reasonable concerns there about the nutrient intake. Admittedly, I think a lot of that is dogmatic. But yes, the Sean Baker approved approach of don't worry about it, just shove some steak down your half a pound, a pound of steak a day, and you'll be fine.
He's a couple
probably
of pounds a meal. It's insane.
Yeah. So Yeah, in that sense, it is something I think only a small section of the population that I work with will ever need to look at. But I think it's a fascinating area because it really does separate dogmatic practitioners from those who are willing to look with their own eyes as to what the evidence says. And so, yes, the first time I was faced with the carnivore diet, I was working with a lady who was, no matter what we did, we were seeing incremental improvements here and, improvements on test results. That was easy to achieve, but she was still feeling very puffy all the time, constant histamine type reactions. And so, she found that the less vegetables she ate, the better. So we pursued this. We checked her nutritional status before. We gave her a multivitamin. So I advised her on the blend of various foods. And yes, it needs. We know that plenty of humans have thrived on animal-only diets.
Yeah.
We also know that those same populations will go to great extent to add additional plant foods when they get the chance. So just because we can doesn't mean that we should. But in any case, yes. So this was a scenario with this lady, and she took away all of plant foods and suddenly slept through the night for the first time in over a decade. And following that, there was no histamine issues. There was a whole overnight shift. So it was very clear that this had allowed her freedom from symptoms that had been troubling her for so long and remained resistant no matter what we did elsewhere. Long story short, we tried many times to bring back in different types of vegetables, and we failed repeatedly. But once we got control of the gut, and then she could tolerate a small amount, which then eventually became a larger amount. And so that was, I think, a good success story for that type of approach. But I think that it's really worthwhile talking about hormesis when it comes to carnivore versus non-carnivore diet, because again, it's so interesting. I always use the term plant poisons, which seems to be a bit of an upsetting term for most people that think I'm jabbing at their kale smoothie. Whereas, and this is the thing, we need to understand exercise is a form of hormesis. Exercise is bad for us. Exercise damages our cells, but our response to exercise is good for us. And in most cases, it will see us not just repair the cells, but actually repair them stronger than their way began. So we're now better prepared for the next insult, the next time it comes around. And that's how plant poisons work. Sorry, polyphenols, phytonutrients. These polyphenols are toxic to human cells, but they're not massively toxic. They're only a tiny bit toxic, and provided our cellular protection responses are working well, we're going to see a disproportionately beneficial response to it. We're not just compensating for the insult that we've received from these plants. We're also going to induce increased antioxidant activity. Our cells are better able now to handle toxins from any other stressors that we may encounter. Lovely. Apart from those people whose cellular protection responses aren't working well. And so for those people, we're going to need to look at dialing down their intake of polyphenols. These are the people that every time they have a superfood of any kind, any adaptogenic herb, herbs especially, are super rich in polyphenols.
Yeah.
They're the individuals that often we're looking at in these environments.
That's super interesting. Super interesting. And in terms of, not that long ago, we were thinking that hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's was irreversible. Have you seen instances, and I'm guessing that it's going to be yes, but like reversal of of symptoms, not just symptoms though, but biochemical tests that show reversal of Hashimoto's hypothyroidism or indeed hyperthyroidism from interventions that you've done in the past?
Yeah, so it's been fascinating to see how many times this has happened, but also when it's happened within the journey, and what was the factor. So, for example, I can recall one lady coming to see me, and she'd had Hashimoto's thyroiditis for over 20 years. And what was so shocking about that one is before her third appointment, she went and had a retest, and the antibody count had already dropped into normal. And so we hadn't really sunk our teeth into it properly at that stage. And in most cases, in the first 3 appointments, I'm looking more to build a map of what's going on within the metabolism of this person. And the way is best to do that, yes, we'll start with the organic acids tests and some screening. We'll build a timeline. I'll have them fill out a detailed questionnaire, and we start connecting up symptom clusters. And from that, we're identifying the obvious obstacles. And so I'm looking at removing those obvious obstacles as a form of test, and their response to the removal of those obvious obstacles. How much of an improvement do they see from that? And in what areas do they see from that? That is a really good way of us working out, okay, well, how many non-obvious obstacles do they have left? And in what areas should we go hunting for them? But what's funny is when we do that and the individual suddenly gets so much better as a side effect of our map building process. So yes, in this lady, I gave her some digestive support, betaine hydrochloride, to help with the digestion. And I had expected that we will probably need to add to that. We'll probably need to go beyond it. We never got around to that. I'd also given her magnesium to help with her sleep. That was very well received. And yeah, we'd taken away some oxalates from her diet. I don't think that was actually the biggest deal. I don't think, because of the speed with which we saw this change with oxalates, it often does take several months to truly manifest these rewards. But she responded really well that first session. Second session, we had now gone and done an adrenal stress profile, saw some low cortisol. So I gave her some licorice root. That had really strong impacts in her response. She felt a whole lot stronger, yet calmer. She was more awake in the day, more asleep at night. Responses to stress were no longer pronounced. She could go long periods of time between meals, and it was no longer a problem. She was no longer dizzy upon standing. Her blood pressure was normalized. There was a whole load of benefits just from the licorice root. So that was pleasing. But then, of course, I get the email to say, "You're not going to believe this. I no longer have any raised antibodies." So this was 20 odd years, regular testing, and suddenly it's gone. So
God, that's long term to have reversal.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
And I wanted to highlight that one because that one is actually unusual. Yeah. I don't normally see it happen that quick, and I'll happily share more complex ones as well.
Well, for the nature of this, I think that illustrates the point beautifully, though, that, that they can be more complex, but quite often simple changes can have a profound effect on people's symptomology, or indeed just sometimes I feel in autoimmune conditions, and when I've spoken to practitioners before, I think this resonates with them, that sometimes a condition is too far gone to completely see complete reversal. However, you can always, doesn't matter what stage you are, what kind of condition you have, improve quality of life.
Well, when you think of all of the angles that are open to us, when you think of, all of the options, is there anyone with chronic issues that we're going to see whose digestive process cannot be better supported, whose environment, do 100% of them live in mold-free environments? Absolutely not. I'd say about 60% of the chronic cases I deal with have these issues. What's their mitochondrial support looking at? I'm shocked at how many people I see who have tried everything before seeing me, and they've never had an organic acids test. And I can see you've got some raging shortages of carnitine and B1, or maybe somebody else has, a absolute lack of B2 or CoQ10. Any one of these is going to have catastrophic effects in limiting their energy availability. And so, it's fascinating how many times people have never had their vitamin D pathway measured. They might have had the storage form measured, and it's okay. But then we think, well, let's actually look at the pathway and see, is there any vitamin D activity? And we look at their parathyroid hormone, which tells us the cellular thirst, and it's through the roof. So we know that their vitamin D is not affecting the cells. There's a blockage somewhere. We may well find that, they just don't have the hypoxia response. They can't manifest a response to hypoxia. They may well not have eaten liver for decades. And if they happen to be one of the 40% of the population with a BCO mutation, beta-carotene oxo mutation, then they're not going to be able to form retinol, real vitamin A. That thing that helps with membrane function and allows for the gut to do what it's meant to do, or allows the mitochondria to produce energy, given that the actual energy producing reaction occurs on mitochondrial membranes. But the interesting thing is that, as you say, maybe we can undertake some decent screening. We can pick at 3, 4, 5 different areas and see improvements in a lot of things, and they're not actually fixed, perfect, wonderful, shiny, bouncy, bubbly. But the mathematical likelihood of not seeing any improvements is so small.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the listeners, by the way, I'm just going to drop the link to the organic acids test in the show notes, because I know people are going to be interested in that. Have you published case studies on this, by the way? Because you've highlighted 2 extremely interesting ones.
So I'm in the process of doing that, actually.
You have to, mate.
The lockdown, I've decided that, you know what, living behind my digital rock is probably not serving the purposes that I could be. So yes, I am in the process of formulating some case studies and how to use the organic acids test. Unfortunately, in recent years, my spare time has pretty much been taken up with the academy where I train other practitioners, and so that was the primary angle through which I was trying to get more information out. Enough information to get out. But yeah, it's I think, as you say, it's there is a lot of options open to us. Whether that's in getting the liver / bile / that drainage pathway working, whether that's in strengthening the gut lining, whether that's binding up endotoxins that could otherwise exploit those issues, whether that's in supporting immunotolerance, when you're looking at glutathione, looking at folate, looking at vitamin A, vitamin D, as I've mentioned, looking at inflammatory processes. Maybe we're looking at the peroxynitrite cycle, which combines your mitochondrial issues with inflammatory control. And there's so many different things we can take a look at. And it's worrying sometimes that people have seen the SIBO guy, they've seen the thyroid lady, and they've tried a heavy metal detox, which predictably went horribly, catastrophically wrong, and it feels to them like they've tried everything. And at no point have they undergone a reasonable testing process that aims to do that thing where we assess, do you actually have a fair chance of responding to a protocol right now?
Yeah, exactly. Like, where's the sticking point? And I think, you know, it's difficult. And I have this, what would you call it? I guess just predicament in my mind where, you know, functional medicine, I think, is wonderful. And, you know, it's got a lot of acceptance in the US and not as much here, to be fair.
Very true.
But there are a portion of nutritional therapists like yourself and functional medicine practitioners, whether that be doctors, chiropractors, or osteopaths, etc. But it is sometimes quite expensive to come and see one of us, right?
Well, it is.
Yeah, and that can put people off because obviously they're seeing their doctor, they assume the conventional way, and don't get me wrong, doctors in the NHS are absolutely wonderful, you know, God bless each and every one of them. I'm not even religious, but there you go. I think they're great. But, you know, it can be difficult to kind of pull away from my local GP that I've maybe known for 10 years to go see someone which I don't know, which I'll have to give them money for, might be very expensive. And these functional tests are often quite expensive for something which in their mind may or may not work.
Well, exactly. And I know that the rates I charge are quite pricey. There's no beating around the bush there. I mean, I'm doing 3 offline hours for every 1 frontline hour because it does involve the data gathering, the analysis. Absolutely. And there's no way to do this and allow for a fair chance without properly delving into it and building that map. And so the fact is, if we're going to treat it and really dive into that case, there's going to be some hours that we need to put in. Sometimes I will have to spend what I thought was going to be 20 minutes researching something for an individual with an unusual scenario, and 6 hours later I realize I haven't yet actually correlated the answers I'm after. Equally, on top of that, how are we going to get proper data if we don't test? I think there's something to be said for being economical with the tests that we order, and I'm always very keen that the tests we order are those that have a high likelihood of impacting my recommendations that I'm going to make, that we can action stuff from it rather than do what unfortunately seems to be becoming more popular. You've got some imbalances there, so we'll work on that. But first, I actually just want to try. Let's throw some B12 at you and see what that does. We'll come back to the test. It's got a few things. We'll talk about that later. So there's certain tests that I used to run, and then it turned out they were never generating any surprises. Yeah. And so. They're actually not impacting on my clinical recommendations, so we can skip them. It's going to require a shift, I think. At this stage, the only population that tends to be ready to throw their oar in are those that have run out of other options.
Right.
And it's a shame because, well, I know that it's a whole lot easier to avoid falling off that cliff than it is to take that horrible, painful, draining climb back up after falling off.
Definitely prevention is better than the cure. I think
agree.
always. And, so we've touched upon kind of what hypothyroidism is, stress, as well as chemicals and molds, which can cause it, as well as also dietary elements, including autoimmune, paleo, and carnivore, which I'm actually interested in trying, although I don't think I ever will. But
it's a very interesting one. I obviously tried it.
oh yeah,
I didn't feel any difference from it myself.
Yeah. Do you normally have a ketogenic diet to begin with?
So I will often cycle in and out of ketosis.
Yeah.
Often, I mean, depending if I'm training hard, which from time to time becomes a pipe dream. Then I'm more likely to eat a carb-based diet when I'm training, especially if I'm doing any form of competition. But under normal circumstances, it's about 50-50 that I'll spend between the two. Back when my mitochondrial processes were chaotic and underpowering, that is where I did spend a very substantial time in ketosis, and that had a very valuable payoff for me. At these stages, I'm essentially trying to honor the evolutionary design of our bodies, which have been sculpted and have evolved in circumstances where we undoubtedly would have spent time being well fueled with some delicious carby feasts, but also sustained periods in ketosis. So trying to honor that works very well, both in theory and in practice.
I try and cycle in and out of it and do so quite regularly also. But I guess what I found difficult with ketosis is you're limited when you're going out for dinner or something like that. Or if you're eating at friends or you're going to your friend's house and you're like, oh, by the way, I'm not eating any starches. It can just be a bit. And it's the same with like alcohol. Yes, I'm a nutritionist, but yes, I do have a beer on occasion. And that knocks you straight out.
Which is nice.
Yeah.
And I've always thought of it this way. Sometimes where you probably noticed a similar experience in some conferences and the practitioners competing to see who is the holiest and purest eater. Well, you may be low carb, but I actually haven't even looked at the carb. I will literally blindfold myself in Tesco to avoid looking at pasta. Alcohol, but alcohol's bad, and yes, it's going to have toxic effects at the liver. It can potentially cause these permeability issues at the gut. It can cause oxidative stress at the mitochondria. I know this, but also I'm a human, and sometimes going out and having a few beers with some pals is good for my soul.
Yeah,
and
absolutely
if I,
right.
as a nutritional therapist, haven't got the capacity to protect my liver, if I haven't got the means with which to mitigate the damage that I need to be scared of alcohol, then clearly I'm doing something wrong, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I entirely agree. There's always a balance to be struck, and you're right. It does wonders for my mental health, I think. But the social environment, I mean, less the alcohol, but I do enjoy it.
Well, exactly. Everything in moderation, including moderation.
Yes.
Unless, of course, it's going to mess you up. In which case,
Oh,
don't do it. Or at least wait until the gut line is a better place.
Yeah, and you can tolerate it.
What's in our best interests?
Exactly.
Rather than what should we be doing or what we're told we should be doing.
I just want to touch upon one thing for people listening. When we spoke about the autoimmune paleo diet and the carnivore diet, I always think like if you're doing any major nutritional change or anything, or you want to try all these diets, and I'll link to them below, please do them under the consultation or guidance of a health professional, whether that be a doctor or a nutritionist or nutritional therapist, dietitian, etc. I think that's really important just to highlight.
I think we've probably both been exposed to experiments gone wrong. People limping into clinic with a sheepish look on their face and saying,
I've only eaten cabbage
it sounded
soup
like
for
a good idea.
I've got one more topic I want to touch upon, and then I want to get into how people can action these things and work with their doctor. Nutrients is something that we kind of touched upon at the beginning, but in particular selenium and iodine, which you can get from foods, are so important for thyroid function. And I see people thinking, or they'll read on the internet, Dr. Google, I think I've got low thyroid function, I've got the symptoms, so I'm going to supplement selenium and iodine. And I have this problem because I've heard of cases where too much iodine can cause the symptoms of hypothyroidism. And equally, you know, if you don't have them in your diet, I've heard that as well. What should people do, I guess?
Well, yeah, and I think that it's obviously first important to recognize that, yes, if people are nutritionally deficient, if they don't have those, you know, the nutrient status to form thyroid hormones, iodine is vital for the formation of these thyroid hormones. And but we generally don't need much. So around about 125 micrograms per day, which is a very small amount. That's all that's called for people who are eating seafood on a regular basis. I cannot fathom that they're going to run into trouble. There is obviously a very interesting discussion to be had about higher dose iodine, because there sometimes is a misunderstanding in that, well, if iodine deficiency causes hypothyroidism, well, is loads of iodine going to increase my thyroid output? And the answer is no. No, it's not. But high dose iodine has a fascinating relationship with the thyroid, because it can solve a lot of problems and it can cause a lot of problems too. So the case for is based on the way when we eat high dose iodine in the realms of several milligrams per day, not micrograms, but milligrams, then we see the cells become saturated with iodine. Mucous membranes tend to take up a huge amount. Breast tissue will also suck up a huge amount. But then what's left over can actually start to form a really interesting chemical called iodolactones, which, as the name suggests, is a fatty chemical bind with the iodine molecule. And that seems to have a very interesting role in controlling the incidence of autoimmunity, and has therefore been suggested as the solution to thyroid issues, Hashimoto's thyroid issues. Now, the problem with that is that there's a lot of people for whom they benefit from that. But there's a lot of people for whom this iodine allows for a substantial increase in thyroglobulin. And if you happen to have anti-thyroglobulin antibodies that's driving your autoimmunity, well, now you've actually created more targets for this antibody to attack. And thus a flare can occur. And it's something that I have seen happen. I've actually seen more people be helped than be harmed. And the really interesting thing there is the glutathione status, antioxidant status does seem to be a really big deal in that. There's research which shows that this iodine flaring response, it happens much less if the population receiving iodine have selenium supplementation. And selenium works to help regenerate glutathione, one of its most important roles. So, yes, I feel that one misinterpretation of that study was that, well, if we take selenium, we'll be fine. Whereas selenium allows that glutathione regenerating enzyme to work. But there's plenty of other factors that could mess with glutathione status, mainly uncontrolled inflammation. So that's why it's not a ticket and a license to go experimenting and hoping that this doesn't wreck your thyroid. But yes, it's a great example of how the same response, the same therapeutic protocol, can have such wonderfully positive impacts in some people, and yet have quite harmful impacts with people with the same condition.
Mm-hmm.
So that is something we can take from the iodine discussion.
And just to add to that, it's really interesting when you look at food sources of iodine. And I think the only kind of group is South Asian communities or Southeast Asian communities and places like Japan, where they eat a lot of sea kelp and stuff, where they're actually having milligrams of iodine. I think in every other population, you're looking at micrograms in terms of a daily dosage from their traditional diet. And with selenium, and I've said this in about 5 podcasts now, so listeners are going to get really bored of me saying this, but you see some instances of selenium toxicity with supplementation, but you see none through food intake, because obviously Brazil nuts, hugely high in selenium. However, there's never, unless someone's going to write in and prove me wrong, but there's never been a documented case, to my knowledge, of someone having a selenium toxicity or getting selenium toxicity through Brazil nut consumption, which I find fascinating.
Well, it is interesting, isn't it? And I actually wonder how much of that is due to regulation via appetite, because it's been interesting. On several occasions, I've run mineral tests that have highlighted low selenium, and in most cases, why do we want to add another supplement in? Let's be honest, when I go to an organic acids test and then we add another test, it sometimes can be a case they've already got a decent number in. I'm not going to back off from giving them what they need on the dogmatic basis of, well, we don't want to give them a long list. It's true we don't, but they need what they need. If selenium's available in Brazil nuts, why not use them? And I do acknowledge that there can be a high variability from one Brazil nut to the next. And so, yes, we've got that issue of what can we know exactly how many micrograms? Well, let's test several weeks later. But what's been really fascinating when I've done that, and we've undergone the retest, every time someone's ended up in the higher levels of normal, I've never seen them gone excessive. But in the higher levels of normal, they almost always say, do you know what? I was gobbling down those Brazil nuts with abandon for several weeks. But you know what? As of about 3 weeks back, I just didn't fancy anymore. So, and that's a pattern I've seen repeated several times. So clearly, there's a point. Someone's low in selenium. They find Brazil nuts one of their tastiest treats. And then they reach a point where they just don't want them anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite a great usage of taste buds.
Yeah, exactly. There's some research to support this. It's like nutrient sensing of foods, and how people, if they're deficient in something, they'll want more of it, even if it's a whole food. Because I think there's a difference between wanting a selenium infused pancake compared to a Brazil nut, right? So let's just to make that clear distinction. But yeah, fascinating area. I don't know much about it, but it's cool that you've seen that.
Well, we see it also with people in low in copper or magnesium. Well, there's a great food that is high in both, which is cocoa. Some people do have a unexplainable, single-minded craving for chocolate. And, sometimes it's not about the copper or the magnesium, admittedly. But it is interesting when I have worked with people with low copper, low magnesium, we've dealt with those. People say, I just don't get the chocolate cravings anymore. Still tastes nice, but I don't need it anymore.
That's really fascinating, because I, for a long time, craved dark chocolate and I only eat above 85%, right? And I went to 100% recently. There's a couple of brands which do it.
Good luck with that.
I don't know how they've made it, but it's 100%. And I loved it for a time. And then now I don't buy it anymore.
I've tried 100% cocoa.
Yeah, it's super bitter. Yeah.
Oh, it's so bitter. 90% I can get down with. That's fine. 85% I enjoy.
Yeah. I'm with you on that 100%. One now.
100% just seems that's too much.
Yeah, it's torturous for some people. I know. I've seen
I thought just that little extra makes all the difference. So there's a good use of 10% sugar, right?
Yeah. So the last thing I want to touch upon is a lot of people might be at home thinking, right, I'm taking Thyroid or whatever thyroid medication they're on, levothyroxine, for example, and they're working with a nutritionist, or they want to, and they're thinking, how can I get off my medication? Because the last thing I think both of us want them to do is stop immediately.
Well, yeah.
So I just
people are going to notice that.
Yeah. So how do you work, I guess, with doctors? With that patient that you mentioned before with the huge reversal of hypothyroidism, how did that work, that interaction with the medical professional?
Yeah, so this was where she actually was going to the doctor anyway and happened to mention that she had a whole load of energy. And it turned out that she was a little bit over-medicated at that point. And that's the most common issue. Now, the good news being that if somebody no longer needs all of that medication, well, initially we'll see their TSH just drop right down. So there's this early stage where they no longer need the medication, or at least they no longer need the dose that they're on. They haven't yet moved into hyperthyroidism. They're not yet getting big bulging eyes. They're not yet spending their evenings staring at the ceiling because they can't sleep. They're not yet sweating all day, every day. But their brain is already registering the level of active thyroid hormones that's saying, whoa, and dialing down the stimulation. So if we happen to know which interventions are likely to aid in thyroid metabolism, those are the times when I would normally look for both symptoms and key signs, especially, for example, temperature thermometer measurements. Now, you cannot gauge thyroid function by the thermometer alone, but it's a very interesting clue when something's changed. And if somebody's temperatures are now registering more than 37 degrees every single day, and they're not subject to super high stress and adrenaline, which can raise temperatures, they're not subject to immune activity, which could induce fever, and we've actually implemented changes that we know are likely to allow for better functioning of their thyroid enzymes, well, now we've got all of the signs that they have just seen a shift, in which case, let's get them back to their doctor. And that actually makes it quite easy to catch these changes before they have to suffer, the hyper symptoms that we really would rather they not experience. So, by using a combination of good old observation of symptoms and, the thermometer too, but equally, I've done more than my fair share of statistical analyses, and I can see with these individuals with these particular symptoms, well, there's a pretty decent chance that when I provide this inflammatory support, in their case, this could be the point at which we see a shift. And so if at that point, which I'll have put a warning in their notes, look out for these symptoms, make sure you do measure your temperatures on these days. If we see any signs, well, let's take them back to the doctors. And sure enough, we are likely to end up with that what's becoming a classic response. Well, it won't be the nutrition that's done this, but yes, we'll lower your dose. I don't know why for the first time in years you need a lower dose, but yes, clearly you're over-medicated. Let's lower it. But it's not the nutrition.
How receptive are doctors if you do work with them? Do you ever write doctor's notes or things like that, or are there certain professionals which you work with on a regular basis?
Yeah, to be honest, most are pretty receptive. There's some that aren't, which sometimes leads to some interesting discussions. So yeah, sometimes the fact that my letterhead, has Harley Street written on it, it shouldn't make any difference, and yet it does. So it hasn't generally been much of a problem when it comes to writing brief notes. I try and keep it a paragraph long, so that I am always providing a suggestion and nothing else. But of course, I've been doing this a while, and I do have stories which we'll probably touch on another time. Some of them are funny, some of them are just confusing, where the N word clearly has caused great insults that this patient would dare go outside of mainstream medicine and consult a nutritionist.
I'm glad I brought that up, and I think a lot of people have experienced that before, so you're not alone in that regard.
Yeah, it definitely can happen for sure. But yes, my favourite is always when I don't know what made this change that we've been seeking for years, but it definitely wouldn't have been the nutrition.
We're not going to dive into that hole because we'll just never stop. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on to the last three questions, or that brings us to the last three questions, which I ask everyone who comes on the show. The first one is, what is the most impactful health change that you've made in your life, and why?
Do you know what?
It can be anything.
That's a very difficult one. I don't think I could really pinpoint one. I would just be offering something for the sake of it. The most effective supplement I've ever taken, magnesium. The most effective dietary protocol, keto. The most effective antimicrobial measure, eliminating H. pylori. The most effective non-nutritional thing, it's a toss-up between chiropractic adjustments and dealing with a dental infection. So there's been a lot going on. I mean, this is totally papering over solving nutritional support for mitochondria. It's totally papering over, the opening up of phase 3 detox at the liver, and I haven't even touched on adrenal issues, which for many years people assumed that was my thing, and it was one of many things. But adrenal support, maybe that was possibly the biggest one thing. There's been a lot of things on the way, so I apologize for ducking that question, but I just couldn't give you a genuine answer to that.
That's really interesting because I guess it's just everyone's different, and if you have like so many things that you're trialing, I can understand why. Some people are just like, hot yoga changed my life, or something where it was just like one thing, and like that definitely moved the dial massively more so than everything else. And the chiropractic adjustment, I don't think anyone has mentioned that before. So I can remember it was a Thursday morning. I know that because I was in Harley Street on Thursday afternoon. I had 3 appointments, and I remember I had the adjustment going in there, and on the way out, the chiropractor said to me, "You might find yourself really sleepy, which should be totally normal because oxygen is now rushing to your head." This was a massive adjustment. I was like, "Okay, cool." And sure enough, sitting down was a problem because I now found that my eyes were just starting to drop, and I had never felt that sleepy during the daytime. Last 10 minutes of the appointment, I was struggling to keep eye contact because I'm blinking so hard. And then, joy of joy, something that almost never happened. I had a cancellation last minute. My assistant texted me, "By the way, 120 is not coming in." And I thought, amazing.
and I just slept for an hour, and that was enough to get me through the afternoon. But what a difference! So and then that night I went and slept for 12 hours. But yeah, so I can attest to the difference going from being starved of oxygen to having oxygen. It's really nice to give your brain oxygen.
Right. I'm definitely going to have to go to a chiropractor now. I don't think there's anything wrong with me, but just that story's enough, I think.
Well, if you're a human being and you haven't had your posture adjusted, again, let's look at tribal societies, your traditional healing. They never skip the body work.
Yeah.
And so, do we think we can, play these sports? I mean, I had 2 decades of football and a lot of collisions in central midfield, many of which were my instigation. Martial arts. I competed in Muay Thai. It's fair to say I took a fair share of hits in that time. And there's just real life. Like, we fall, we slip, we're constantly stressing our spine. To think that I waited till I was 27 before I had a chiropractic adjustment.
Right. I'm booking it. I'll let you know.
There you go. Sold.
How can healthcare become more integrated in the kind of modalities that we've touched upon in this podcast?
So again, I mean, I could give you a 37-point list, but I think it is more basic than that. I think read the literature. Don't just read the summary. Well, in fact, reading the summary would be a start, but actually read it. I know I spoke about the Silver and Larson 1979 paper, which still isn't being applied. Just reading, I think, would be a useful thing rather than just leaning on what they were told by some grey old professor back in the late 70s. That's not enough. So reading would be one. And 2, I think questioning the statements we make. If they say, there's no cure, I think that would be a really good question. For example, autoimmune Hashimoto's thyroiditis. That's not a thyroid issue. That's an immune issue that is manifesting at thyroid. So we are consistently fed this idea that there's no cure for that. But it wasn't happening 2 months back. Now it is happening. Something changed to trigger this process. And admittedly, it can be very hard to break these self-perpetuating cycles. But when they have taken precisely 0 steps to try and understand what's driving it, and have only just compensated by replacing with the hormones that aren't being formed, they've taken no attempt to understand it, no attempt to actually deal with it, and are then saying, nothing you can do about it. So that's where I said, questioning the statements that we make would be a good start.
And I've got one final question, but before I ask it, it's been wonderful to have you on, by the way, but could you please tell the listeners where they can find you?
Fun ranting.
Yeah. But can you tell the listeners where they can find you and what exciting projects that you have coming up?
So they can find me at my website, marekdoyle.com. There's some articles on there, and the best thing about them is that I agree with everything within those articles. They can find me at Instagram, Marek Doyle Nutrition. And what am I working on right now? I'm actually just trying to put together some QuickBooks, 20-page down and dirty guides that will, on a number of subjects that I'm dealing with all the time, that will be a case of, here's some key principles, here's the most common mistakes, here's things that make a difference, and who's likely to benefit from each individual one. And if it doesn't work, here's where you should look at. So that's coming up at some point. And hopefully that will be useful for some people.
Great. I'll link to your website and all socials in the show notes for everyone. And that brings us to the last final question, Marek. So can you please provide the listeners with 3 tips to help improve their health and well-being from today?
Okay, so number 1, take an organic acids test. 75 different markers across a whole range of systems in the body, neurotransmitters, microbiome indicators, nutritional status, indications whether you can handle certain food chemicals, your glutathione status, and also a really good insight to what's going on in your mitochondria. It's not as mysterious as people think, and when you have a glimpse that tells you where the blockages are, it's quite easy to unblock those blockages. So I've never seen an organic acids test that didn't come with actionable steps. So that's number 1. Number 2, rest when you need to rest. Sounds simple, but if rest is stressful for you, and that's a lot of people out there, that actually feel very stressed. They find themselves agitated by not doing things. Well, then investigate why. I'm not here to provide the answers to that. That's a very, very big question. But rest. We are humans. And the only thing that's more impressive than our capacity to do stuff is our insistence on pushing it one step too far. So that is number 2. And number 3 would be stop asking what's good and what's bad, or what's effective and what's ineffective, and instead consider when is something likely to work. In who is it likely to work in? And of course, the underlying question there is why. Mechanisms allow us to identify who is suitable for what intervention and when is it likely to work, when is it not. But this idea that we're obsessed with what's a good way to solve adrenal issues? What's a good mitochondrial supplement? Doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. So not what, but when and why. And who.
Love it. Marek, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. I think we've spoken for the best part of 2 hours there, and I've enjoyed every second. It's been really interesting.
Well, I guess we call that a half marathon at 2 hours.
Yeah. I think I did mine in 3 hours 51, so close enough.
Okay. Do you want to know a bit of trivia? Sure. I've done 4 marathons in my time, and my personal best is 3 hours 51.
No way.
Yeah. Oh, Edinburgh Marathon, 2008.
Yeah, I did Brighton, 2018. Oh, nice. Yeah.
Okay, so if we were to race now, there's only one winner then.
Maybe. I don't know how fast you are, but we'll see.
I feel my cardiovascular condition is not at its peak right now.
I'll cut this bit out.
Yeah, I'm comfortable. I'm still strong. So as long as that's the case, I'll be all right.
It's been a huge pleasure again, and I do hope we can do this again soon.
Oh no, I'm down. I feel like we covered so much, but there was more that we didn't cover.
Yeah.
Well, we'll touch base on that.
All right. See you next time. Thank you for listening to the Functional Health Podcast. You can find links to everything that we talked about today in the show notes. If you have a second, please consider leaving a 5-star rating on iTunes. It really does make a huge difference and helps get this valuable information out and reach more people. Don't forget to subscribe so you can stay up to date and know whenever I release a new episode. You can connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, or our website, and all questions are welcome. As always, thanks to Josh Aurelia for the editing and Alan Harper for his support.